So then, welcome ladies and gentlemen, and any boys and girls who might be listening as well, because this place is all inclusive. My name is Andrea Moda, and welcome to the first episode of That Racing History Podcast, the podcast that boils down the history of the motorsport world into a simple and regular podcast that hopefully allows you to learn more about the history of motorsport. Looking at the past happenings in the world of Formula 1, IndyCar, NASCAR, BTCC, V8 supercars, endurance racing, and helping you to understand history's biggest motorsport cheats, racing's biggest accidents, the big controversies, and those tiny little bits of aero innovation that gave the underdog their day, or, in some cases, caused others to quit in protest. So if you know me, you'll know the series Storytime. It was the motorsport series that brought you the weird, wonderful, wacky, and just generally interesting stuff from the real world of motorsport. But after a certain setback near the end of 2020, I figured, well, people just listen to it anyway, so why not just do it as a podcast? That's what people wanted, so give them what they want. So I paid someone to make some graphics, I gave it a name that basically did exactly what it said on the tin, and also stuck out, and we have That Motorsport History Podcast, because that's what this is. And let's be honest, Storytime is just what the beauty YouTubers start hashtagging when they've had a panic attack because their Uber parked 10 yards away from their house and they thought they were being kidnapped. So with all that out of the way, let's get into the first episode, and I figured I might as well just start at the beginning, where this all began, and, well, let's be honest, it was a throwaway video that became a popular series that made me more of a historian and storyteller rather than a sim racing YouTuber. And we might as well save the worst for first, rather than saving the best for last. That'll be the Roberto Moreno episode at 100,000 YouTube subscribers. Bet's a bet. So, on this occasion, we're looking at possibly the worst team ever to participate in Formula 1. Now, there have been a few terrible teams. There was the Life team that never qualified. There was the more recent HRT team. There was Caterham, Lola, who only lasted one race in 1997, and we will get to most of those teams, or if not all of those teams, later on in this series. I mean, I've got about 70 episodes of this to remake. But no team in Formula 1 not only performed this badly, but was also run this badly. The year is 1992, and the team is Andrea Moda. Now, Andrea Moda wasn't a team that just turned up out of nowhere, tried Formula 1, and wasn't particularly good at it. Well, I mean, it was, but there is a lot more to it than that. If it was just they were terrible, then there would be no need for this podcast. The team had its roots in the Coloni Formula 1 team that was, in inverted commas, racing at the back of the grid in the tail end of the 1980s. Then in 1990, Coloni was backed by Subaru, but Subaru tried to power the car with a flat 12 engine that was just totally obsolete and hadn't been used in Formula 1 since Ferrari was running them in the late 1970s. To boil it down into very simple terms, the flat 12 in Formula 1 was dead. It was V configuration or nothing. And even Ferrari, the biggest fans of the flat 12 in history, were only using it in the Testarossa at that time. Now, given how terrible the car was, Subaru abandoned Formula 1 and left Coloni without an engine. But they did, however, get an emergency supply of Ford engines during 1991. But Bertrand Gachot had left for Jordan, and later the Her Majesty's Prism Brixton F1 team, and left Coloni with no sponsors. So Coloni was facing a 1992 season with a car that would have been uncompetitive by 1985 standards, let alone 1992. By the time 1992 had rolled around, the team consisted of just 6 people, and the development of the chassis was left to a bunch of physics students at the nearby university. So imagine Jaguar in the early 2000s heading for Birmingham City University and saying, "Would you mind awfully figuring out the drag coefficient on our car?" And Enzo Coloni, the team owner, well, he basically had enough, and he managed to get rid of his team. It was said at the time that the team had been sold for $8 million to a mystery investor. And the mystery investor was a total nobody. But at least our mystery investor has a name, Andrea Sassetti, a shoe magnate from Italy who bought everything Coloni had and renamed the team. And the name came from Sassetti's shoe company, Andrea Moda, which translates to Andrea Clothing in English. It also has to be said that when you can find more information about the team than you can the shoe company, then it's safe to say that perhaps Andrea Moda wasn't exactly a market leader. They weren't exactly leaving Dykeman or Hush Puppies quaking in their boots. No pun intended. Now, the FIA must have thought, what the hell is going on here? Because The fact that the team had only cost $8 million should have been enough to make them take notice. Why was that? Well, Coloni had a warehouse in Perugia that was the factory. They had an ancient car that would have struggled to compete in the Australian Touring Car Championship, and there weren't enough team members to start a football team. Well, they didn't even have enough to start a five-a-side football team. It had gotten that bad. Long story short, Coloni had nothing worth buying, and I'm sure Enzo Coloni had laughed all the way to his local bank. And while $8 million would have worked for a shoestring, again, no pun intended, team in the 1970s, there was absolutely no way this would have worked in the early 1990s. The season started in South Africa. Well, it started for everybody except Andrea Moda. The team wasn't allowed to race because Sassetti had basically not paid the $100,000 entrance fee for new teams, a figure that is standing at a colossal $250 million today. Now, Sassetti tried to dodge it by saying the team was just Coloni with a new name, which is what Leighton House had done with March, but the FIA wasn't buying it, and this is a theme that will keep on coming up throughout this episode. What had actually happened was that Sassetti had not bought the entry, he just bought the name. He hadn't done his homework, in simple terms. So the car that ran at Kyalami only did a couple of laps before the battery failed, but when you've got a Judd V10 bolted to a chassis designed for a V8, the battery was probably the last thing that they should have been worried about. So the team had travelled all the way to South Africa for a shakedown, and Sassetti had angered his drivers for messing things up. But they honestly needn't have bothered getting angry because it was going to get even worse for the team. The FIA had said that since Andrea Moda was now considered a new team, they weren't allowed to use the car that someone else had designed. Simply put, Andrea Moda's car was the old Coloni C4 from 1991 with a new engine in the back. So the team itself was legal to race. Everything there was kosher. But the car, in the space of the 24 hours or so after the shakedown, had become illegal. So they needed a new car. But how did they even get a car to Brazil in just a few weeks, considering there were so few employees? They'd have to design it, they'd have to build it, they'd have to do a shakedown, they'd have to test it, they'd have to do all these things that cost many monies. So they didn't build a car, they just bought one. It was bought from a company that would turn up in Formula 1 in their own right in a couple of years down the line. Simtech. The car was basically an ex-demonstrator. BMW had been interested in getting into Formula 1 as its own factory team in the early 90s, and Simtech was a company set up in 1989 to be able to provide off-the-shelf cars built using cutting-edge technology. Well, for the time, obviously. So basically, they were doing what Cosworth had done with the DFV, but for cars. Cheap, and at the same time, sort of competitive. But BMW instead decided to commit to DTM as a factory team instead, so it left the car without an owner, despite the fact that Simtech had already built it. So Simtech updated the car to 1992 standards, and then sold it to Sassetti. But in between the South African and Brazilian Grand Prix was the Mexican Grand Prix, and Alex Caffey and Enrico Battaglia, the two drivers that Andrea Moda had hired at the start of the season, got dropped for basically saying, "Dude, where's my car?" Because Andrea Moda had turned up to the Mexican Grand Prix and didn't even bother running. Instead, they hired a guy called Perry McCarthy, who later found fame as the original Stig on Top Gear, and they also hired the biggest forced meme in Formula 1 YouTuber history, Roberto Moreno. I mean, I'm joking here. Max Papis says he's a lovely, lovely man. Moreno was able to give the car a run at Brazil, but McCarthy couldn't because he'd been refused a super license. He finally got one for the round at Barcelona, but the car blew up in the pit lane. But things were going to get worse for McCarthy, because Battaglia came back with about $1 million worth of sponsorship, and Sassetti wanted to drop McCarthy and get the Italian back in the car. But, as always with this team, and it's going to be a running thing across the whole series, I'm going to start sentences with, "but there was an issue." This particular issue is that the FIA was now under the leadership of Simtech co-founder and March co-founder Max Mosley. And Mosley had barred the driver swap due to the rules preventing more than 2 changes of drivers, as well as being a little bit hacked off that Sassetti had already tried to con the FIA deliberately once before, as well as any previous money-related shenanigans. So, out of pure bitterness really, because he just lost a potential $1 million, Sassetti diverted all the resources and all the money to just Moreno's car, and it's probably safe to say that this team had officially become farcical. On the day of pre-qualifying for the Spanish Grand Prix, McCarthy said he'd overslept by a few hours, which isn't really a problem, it happens, but the entire team was in the same hotel. None of them had bothered to wake him up, and instead they'd all travelled to the circuit without him to try and get him to quit. But it's not like Moreno was having a better time of things, because he couldn't even manage a lap before his engine died, and once McCarthy's car was finally able to compete, the mechanics sent him out for his first attempt at driving the S921, and he only managed 18 yards before his battery cut out. But the mechanics set to work on the car, but only so they could switch out McCarthy's still working engine for Moreno's dead one to allow the Brazilian to have another go. But there was a brief glimmer of hope for the team, because at this time there were 32 cars trying to go for 26 spots on the grid, so there was pre-qualifying for any new teams and for any teams with the worst records over the previous 12 months. So at this point, Alboreto for Footwork, Gasho for Venturi, Moreno, Andrea Chiesa for Fond Metal, Ukyo Katayama in the other Venturi, and the other Andrea Moda of McCarthy were the drivers who had to go through this process. The top 4 went through to the 2-session qualifying. They had one on Friday and one on Saturday. Well, one on Thursday and Saturday because it was Monaco, and 30 would be whittled down to 26. Moreno had pulled off some sort of miracle, because he qualified in the top 26 to start the race on the Sunday, but things quickly returned to normal. He lasted 11 laps while being off the pace by 5.5 seconds. Meanwhile, for McCarthy, the neglect he was being shown had transitioned from, "That's not a very nice thing to do," to, "If he crashes, you're looking at manslaughter." The team hadn't made him a proper seat, so he was being thrown around in the cockpit and suffering from double vision as a result. But at least they started the race in last and only 300ths inside the top 26. Then after the race, there was a suspected case of arson at Sassetti's nightclub, which, let's be honest, could have easily been done as an insurance scam given everything else that's going on, and as he ran away from the flames, someone took a shot at him. Take your pick as to who it could be. Could have easily been Bernie, could have been Mosley, could have been anybody. He probably owed a lot of people money. But while the team had tasted racing conditions at Monaco, normal service resumed in Canada. When they arrived in Montreal, they did all their usual checks. Cars? Check. Crew? Check. Tyres? Check. Engines? Check. What? Apparently, the engines were stuck in Italy, and a storm had meant that the flight was cancelled. It was more like Sassetti hadn't paid Judd because Ferrari had arrived just fine. They managed to borrow an engine from Brabham, but even then, the pace wasn't there. On this occasion, it might not have been Sassetti's fault, but at this point the team began to unravel, because the team manager had just quit. The FIA was also becoming more and more agitated, given that they were being quite lenient on the team running 1.5 cars when they declared themselves a 2-team outfit. Then there was the French Grand Prix a fortnight later, and that became an omni-shambles because of a blockade by striking lorry drivers, which closed many of the main roads across the country. The Andrea Moda team failed to make it to Manicourt, which was a bit sus. Ferrari had arrived just fine, Minardi, Venturi, and all the British teams had also managed to get there. The British teams probably had it a little bit harder because they had to get across the channel, meaning that they hadn't just made it to Manicourt, but they'd also managed to get through Calais, which then led to rumours that Andrea Moda had deliberately not shown up to save costs. As always, more excuses followed, but then it caused all the remaining sponsors to withdraw, and the team was hemorrhaging staff. To make matters worse, McCarthy's car was now being used as Moreno's spare, and he was being treated worse and worse by the team. Moreno did 3 laps on wet tyres at Silverstone, but then the track started to dry out, which, happens. But the team then went one step further than ever before in terms of stupid decisions, because they stuck Moreno's used wets onto McCarthy's car and then sent him out on track. In the dry. As you can probably guess, he was way off the pace. 16 seconds to be precise, and that was just off his teammate. Then at the Hungaroring, he was only allowed out of the pit lane 45 seconds from the end of pre-qualifying, making it impossible for him to set a lap. Then withdrawals from other teams meant that at Hungary, only one car had to be eliminated from pre-qualifying, so in theory, McCarthy could have actually made it into the qualifying session proper if he'd made it out of the pit lane in time. But McCarthy was still being treated like crap. But then some good fortune for the Belgian Grand Prix, because both cars would be allowed into the official qualifying sessions, but only by default because the Brabham team had finally folded. Now, pre-qualifying was actually discontinued after 1992, this year, when many of the small teams withdrew from the sport. So with Brabham gone, no more pre-qualifying. So at Spa, McCarthy's car was actually functioning, but neither of them qualified because they never made it into the top 26. And to make things worse for McCarthy, he suffered a major steering failure as a result of a fault the engineers knew existed. In his autobiography, McCarthy wrote, "I went into Eau Rouge desperately trying to take it flat. Then the steering seized. I still don't know how I made it through the corner." He then went and challenged his mechanics, and they weren't concerned at all, because they just said, "Yeah, we know. That's the knackered one we took out of Roberto's car after the last race." Now, critics claim it was Sassetti's attempt to injure McCarthy so he had an excuse to get rid of him and just use one car for the rest of the season, which sounds really far-fetched, but considering everything else Andrea Moda was doing that year, it probably isn't that ludicrous after all. Then within hours of qualifying being over, Sassetti was arrested by the Belgian authorities for fraud. He'd allegedly been forging invoices for parts on the car, although how they caught him doing so, I'm not sure. The FIA had then seen enough, and they'd already warned the team to have McCarthy at least attempt a qualifying run after what happened at Silverstone, and Mosley was at the end of his tether. With Sassetti's arrest, Andrea Moda was then kicked out of the sport for bringing the sport into disrepute, and it's actually the only time this has ever happened. Then in one last flourish of bravery or stupidity, whichever way you want to look at it, Sassetti still sent the trucks to Monza, but was turned away, meaning it took about a week longer for the team to finally end. Now, Sassetti still owns the two cars, probably because no one will buy them, and he still has the shoe company. I mean, I say he still has the shoe company, it has one shop in Singapore, but it still exists. And Andrea Moda was like a roller coaster, only it started at the peak of a small hill and then dropped right into the core of the earth. And Autosport magazine summed up the team's main problem from day one, saying that motor racing should really be left to motor racing people who have a vague idea of what they are doing. The team would then try its luck in kart on the other side of the Atlantic in 1993 with a team called Euro Motorsport, where one of their many drivers in Andrea Montermini, who would later try his hand in Formula 1 over the course of the next few years, would get a fourth at Detroit. As I said earlier in this episode, Perry McCarthy later went on to become Top Gear's first Stig. He also has a book out called Flat Out Flat Broke, Formula 1 the Hard Way, and in that he talks about everything that happened in that period where Andrea Moda was the laughingstock of Formula 1. There is also a full text version of this story written by Matthew Gordon, better known as Darkness Pandemic, and that can be found on Reddit. And it's a witty and humorous way of portraying the story, and it's what Storytime, now That Racing History podcast, was adapted from, and where the idea for the series came from. So thank you to Matt for allowing me to use the original Reddit posts and the unreleased content that he gave me later on, which of course will turn up in later episodes. So that is pretty much it for this first episode. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed and learned something here today, and I can't wait to get the next episode out to you all very soon. So if you did enjoy this, those of you listening via YouTube can like the... Well, it's not really a video, but you can, like it and subscribe, get the bell on so you'll always be notified of a future episode. And if you want to listen to this podcast on the go, this will also be released on Spotify a couple of days after the release on YouTube, purely because that's where my audience primarily is, but it will go up on Spotify as well. So you've got two different ways of listening. If you're on YouTube and you think, well, I don't have a Spotify account, well, you don't need one because you can listen to it on YouTube and, like I say, also on Spotify. That Racing History podcast is a Patreon-backed show, and if you wish to help support this podcast or just my YouTube channel in general at a more personal level, then you can do so by heading to the Patreon page at patreon.com/AidenMillward. That's AidenMillward. So Aiden with an A and not an E. And you can also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and all that good stuff. And there is also a Discord where you can join in the chat there. For YouTube listeners, all that stuff is handily in the description box for you. So until next time, I've been Aiden Millward with That Racing History podcast. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.